In this test, we'll be finding out what the best all-season tyre is for your car, and we'll be including a summer tyre and a winter tyre to see exactly the differences between the three categories of tyres. As usual, I have 10 sets of the latest and greatest all-season tyres, including last year's dual test winner, the Michelin Cross Climate 2 and the Hankook Kinergy 4S2. I am testing in a slightly smaller tyre size this year, so I can get some of the tyre patterns I couldn't get in last year. There'll be a pinned comment below explaining why some of the tyres are missing. Some of it is down to size availability, some of it is down to geopolitical issues, but it'll all be explained below. As always, I'll be testing all 10 sets and the summer and winter tyre in the dry, wet and snow, and we'll be looking at rolling resistance, comfort and noise levels of the tyre to give you a complete picture and allow you to decide which of these tyres is best for your own driving needs. Should be an interesting test. Let's get on with the testing. There are two schools of thoughts about how an all-season tyre should perform in snow. Some testers feel like an all-season tyre should be every bit a match for a winter tyre in snow. And you know what, I don't really subscribe to that. I think an all-season tyre in snow should be vastly superior to a summer tyre, but it doesn't need to be an out-and-out winter tyre. So we're going to hopefully prove that all of these all-season tyres are better than a summer tyre. And well, we have. Spoiler alert. As with most years, I do buy a cheap tyre, a cheap budget tyre. And this year I bought a Leo. You know what? It was absolutely fine. It's about 1.5 minute lap, and this tyre was about 5% off the best. Now, subjectively, it probably was a little bit worse. It was just a little bit curious, actually. I don't recall ever having a tyre that encouraged you to go fast, but then ran out of grip really quickly. It was a curious experience. You felt like you could hammer into a corner, and then you got there and you actually couldn't. The next group of tyres was the Toyo, Hankook and Uniroyal. Now of the three, the Toyo was probably the trickiest to drive, just because it was a little bit peaky and a little bit oversteery, whereas the Hankook and Uniroyal were two of the easiest tyres to drive. They weren't the grippiest, but they were not that far off the best, and they were understeer biased, and that meant I felt it was the easiest tyre for the average person to understand, because you were going to a corner a little bit too quickly. Instead of having to worry about the rear coming around like almost now, not enough front grip on these tyres, you were just worried about on the understeer, which is nice. I guess that's the safe balance, as I've called it before. Falcon was 6th, feeling a bit more like the Hankook and Uniroyal, and a little ahead of that was the Vredstein in 5th. The Vredstein did have a lovely balance. It was a nice tyre to drive. It was just maybe a little bit looser on the rear axle than perhaps was absolutely optimum, but I keep saying this in tyre tests, these differences are small. All these tyres are getting pretty good now. The top 4 tyres were all very impressive all-season tyres for snow performance. Goodyear and Firestone essentially tied in 3rd, both stunning to drive. The Goodyear was probably just a little bit better subjectively. This was a really nice tyre, gave you loads of confidence, no surprises, and you could just push on and everything felt wonderful in the Golf. I know Goodyear, as I'm sure a lot of tyre companies do, develop quite a lot on the VW Golf, and it really does show. Great tyre. The Firestone, good amounts of grip, just perhaps a little bit peakier than the Goodyear. And the top 2 tyres posted exactly the same lap time, so we have a joint winner. And as it's Michelin and Cleber, I can technically say Michelin won snow handling twice because they own the Cleber brand. Both of these tyres was stunning to drive. We know the Cross Climate 2 is a very good tyre in the snow, and now its sister tyre, the slightly sub-brand, the brand new Quadraxor 3 is equally as good. In fact, I test blind, as you all know. I ran the Cleber quite early on in the program, and I was like, this has to be the Michelin, because this is stunning. And then later on I ran the Michelin, or what turned out to be the Michelin, and I was like, oh, that's confusing. Now we've got 2 Michelins in the test. Weird, but I guess technically I was correct. Both of them wonderful. If I had to pick one, it would probably be the Cleber. But if I had to pick one tyre for these conditions, it would be the winter tyre, the Hankook Winter Icept RS3. This tyre just found grip where there was none. Sure, it wasn't massively leaps and bounds ahead of the other tyres, but it was the fastest. But subjectively, it was really nice to drive. You could just feel the more rounded nature of the winter tyre. And as for the summer tyre, well, that was amazing for a summer tyre. It got me around the lap and I didn't die, so that's all I can be really asking for from a summer tyre in the snow. You obviously had to be super delicate, but you know what, laterally it didn't, I want to say it didn't feel bad, but in the context of this test it felt awful, but for a summer tyre it didn't feel bad. Where it really seemed to struggle was we've got a small hill here and the traction of the tyre felt pretty weak. So let's go find out by doing the traction testing.
Would you believe the Michelin Cross Climate 2 was also the best all-season tyre in snow acceleration, just 3% behind the winter tyre? The Firestone narrowly beat the Cleber to 2nd place, and the Goodyear also proved to have excellent snow traction. Snow braking was again led by the Michelin, cementing its unrivaled snow performance for an all-season tyre, with the Firestone and Clever filling second and third spots. The summer tyre had less than half the traction and braking ability of the all-season tyres, taking nearly 40 metres to stop compared to 18 metres of Michelin. Yikes, that's the difference.
Okay, so if you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll know this is usually the part where I talk about the wet handling of the tyres while sliding a car around a track. Sadly, due to the watering system at the track I've used this year being incredibly aggressive, the internal audio sounded like this. Plus the fact that I couldn't get permission to film on dry handling this year, as there were prototypes on track, I just figured it was best to talk about wet and dry performance of the tyres here. Wet braking and wet handling lined up pretty nicely, which is always good to see, apart from the Hankook. This tyre was the best in wet braking, but as it was the worst in aquaplaning, it meant during the wet handling test, it took more of a penalty over the deeper parts of water, the puddles. It also had quite a lot of understeer, which is an easy, safe to handle feature of a tyre and something tyre companies design for, but it does cost you time. The Goodyear Vector 4-Season Generation 3 was second in wet braking and the fastest around the wet handling lap with pretty good aquaplaning resistance. As usual, I did wet handling twice, both times blind in different orders, and both times the Goodyear was clearly the standout for me. It was just lovely and grippy and easy to drive fast. The Vector 4-Season Gen 3 is usually very good in the wet, but in this size it's exceptional. The Clever and Michelin once again finished in very similar positions, both of them feeling better on the brakes than during the handling lap due to high levels of understeer, but both did have good aquaplaning resistance. The Firestone was the opposite of the Hankook. It's 6th in braking, 4% behind, but was one of the best around the handling lap, helped no doubt by good aquaplaning resistance, and it was easy to drive and well balanced. The Falcon was consistent across the two grip tests, but struggled a little more in the deeper water of aquaplaning, and once again I called the handling sporgy, whatever that means, which is quick initial turn, but then it also felt a bit too soft and wobbly on the sidewall, which is an interesting blend of characteristics. It made me laugh that it was the Falcon again, as it's quite a unique feeling. Uniroyal and Vredstein were like chalk and cheese, with the Vredstein feeling great across the lap and posting a good time, but not being the best on the brakes or in the deeper water, whereas Uniroyal was the best of all the tyres in aquaplaning tests, but felt very soft and uninspiring around the lap, plus it struggled on the brakes. Sadly, the Toyo Celsius AS2 didn't seem to have any luck in the wet, with the 9th slowest lap, 9th worst wet braking, and 8th worst aquaplaning resistance. And lastly, the Leo was just lacking grip and braking and handling, which shouldn't be a surprise given it's the cheapest tyre in test. In summary, if the wet performance is key to you, I'd pick the Goodyear or the Hankook. As for the summer and winter tyres, well, that was interesting. The winter tyre was a total dream to drive around a lap, posting the 2nd fastest time, but the extra sipes of the winter tyre meant it wasn't quite matching the best of the all-season tyres in braking. The summer tyre has no sipes, so it was the best in braking, but it had quite poor aquaplaning resistance, meant it wasn't the easiest to drive around the lap. I think this is partly or mostly to do with the fact it's an eco-balanced tyre. So the wet performance of the tyre would have been traded off against rolling resistance, and they do start with lower starting tread depth, these eco tyres. So that would have hurt it in the aquaplaning. As for the dry, the summer tyre was the best and the winter tyre was nearly the worst, so that adds up. As I've said, sipes make performance in the dry hard, especially under braking, and we've seen this again from the data. Dry braking was led by Michelin, with the Clever suspiciously close behind. I hope you're starting to see a trend here. Hankook was once again very good in braking, finishing 3rd, with the Vredstein Quattrack a close 4th. Then there was a bit of a gap to the rest, which was led by Toyo, then Goodyear, Falcon, Leo, Firestone and Uniroyal. As for dry handling, Hankook and Goodyear were back at the front, even beating the summer tyre, which honestly on this one occasion, might have been something to do with my driving. I knew I wasn't super committed on the summer tyre laps due to there was some surprise unusual traffic on the lap, and once you've lost a lap in the dry, the tyre's past its best. Both the Hankook and Goodyear were lovely and predictable to drive, and while dry handling isn't exactly what an all-season tyre is designed for, I did appreciate the performance of them. Michelin and, shock horror, not the Clever, but the Vredstein were close behind in 3rd and 4th. The Vred was a fun tyre, but did feel a little bit mismatched between the front and rear axle, and the Michelin behaved exactly as it always does, with plenty of understeer and didn't really like getting hot, but it's an all-season tyre. We can forgive it for that. The Falcon in 5th was slightly less sporgy, but I did write in my notes that the steering felt quick and disconnected, but otherwise good, so I guess that's just me saying sporgy again. And the Firestone and Leo finished joint 6th. They did feel quite different. The Firestone was well balanced and good to drive, and the Leo felt sluggish, but ended up on the same tyre, so it seems there's more than one way to get around the lap. 8th and 9th were Clever and Toyo, and again Uniroyal finished 10th. So now we know about the wet and dry performance, what about noise and comfort? Well, unfortunately for this test, it wasn't possible to do objective noise measurements due to weather. We had rain, I didn't have enough time. But myself and a colleague did subjective noise and comfort evaluation, which is just as important, I felt. As always, when you're testing on a high profile, small wheel size tyre on a vehicle like the Golf, the differences are very small. However, if noise and comfort is your priority, I would be shopping for the Goodyears. It worked extremely well with the Golf, with the Hankook Michelin and Clever, shock horror, Michelin and Clever, were also very good. If a firmer ride is your thing, for some reason the Toyo was the firmest of the group. The summer tyre was similar to the best of the all seasons, and the winter tyre was just a little bit noisier. As for the rolling resistance of the tyres, well, as I keep saying, this is getting more and more important as energy prices keep increasing. Electricity is going up, fuel costs are going up. So this is a key test. I've put the weighting to 10% as with last year, but maybe you'd want it higher. The lowest rolling resistance tyre on the test was actually the cheapest, the Leo, which even beat the summer tyre. Michelin was the best of the good all-season tyres, with the Goodyear Firestone also sneaking under the 8 kg per tonne mark, and the Hankook and Uniroyal both actually on the dot of 8 kg per tonne. The highest rolling resistance tyre was the Falcon, which was around 12% higher than the Michelin, which equates to approximately 2.5 to 3% more fuel use in the real world. So the final order. If you've watched my videos before, I hope you have, I always talk about score weighting, which is boring but very important, never more important than for an all-season tyre, as different people want different things from an all-season tyre, because they're meant to do well in the dry, wet and snow, and really not any of the tyres do perfectly in all of them. For this test, the main score weighting I'll be using has a lower weighting on snow performance than last year, because I just think putting too much priority on snow isn't right for this category, and I've put more on dry and wet. But if you want a different score weighting, if you really want snow performance, you can head over to the link in the description, Tyre Review's website, plug in your own score weighting, and the results will update based on you. In last place, unsurprisingly, was the Leo iGreen All Season, and somehow it finished behind the summer tyre overall in an all season test. It was really let down by its braking, which is key to safety as we know, but it is cheap to buy and it does have a very low rolling resistance. So if you don't care about grip and you do care about money, see what I'm saying? In fact, but really just don't do it. In fact, if you do, we can't be friends, because it's just not smart. Next up was the Toyo Celsius AS2. Again, it lost out mostly in the wet and snow, and while it was okay in the dry, it really just didn't jump out in any category. Some more work to do for Toyo, but a good foundation. The Uniroyal All-Season Expert was next. It had the best aquaplaning resistance on test, which is something we often see from Uniroyal tyres, but like the Toyo, the grip wasn't really up to the standard of the best in the group in any of the categories, sadly. The Falcon Euro All-Season AS210 finished in 7th place. I liked this tyre in the dry, even if it didn't give the most feedback, and its wet performance was good too. However, it couldn't keep up in the snow and did have the highest rolling resistance, as we just discussed. It's not a bad tyre, but perhaps a tyre more suited to a milder winter climate where you don't see snow often. In contrast to the Falcon, the new Firestone Multi-Season was a very strong tyre in the snow. It was good around wet handling lap and had decent rolling resistance. It wasn't the best in wet or dry braking, which meant it couldn't finish higher up the order, but it was a good effort from the Bridgestone-owned Firestone brand. The Redstone Quadtrack finished in 5th place overall and was back flying around the wet and dry handling laps. It was also good in the snow, with its only real weakness being in wet braking. This is a good product and one I'm glad to recommend at its price point. 4th to 2nd place ended up very tight, but I am highly recommending the next 3 tyres because they're all exceptional tyres. 4th went to the new Clever Quadraxa 3. As I've already said, Clever is a Michelin sub-brand, and while it definitely says Clever on the sidewall, it performed exactly as I would expect a slightly cheaper Cross Climate 2 to perform, which is attractive to a lot of people, I'm sure. It was amazing in the dry, amazing in the snow, okay in the wet. It was also very quiet and comfortable. The biggest downfall when compared to the Michelin was nearly 7% worse rolling resistance, but as a cheaper tyre than the Cross Climate 2, that might be a worthy trade for some people. Next up was the Hankook Kinergy 4S2. This tyre was the best in dry handling, the best in wet braking, good around the wet handling lap, good in dry braking, and was comfortable. It did lose out in the snow compared to the best, but as I said at the start of this, I would rather have an all-season tyre that's good in the dry and wet than one that excels in the snow. That's why we have winter tyres after all. Once again, the Hankook has a balance of an all-season tyre I really like. In 2nd place overall, just 0.2% ahead of the Hankook, was the Goodyear Vector 4-Season Generation 3. Like with the Hankook, the Goodyear was a solid product in the dry, the best around the wet handling lap, and it even edged out the Hankook in both snow performance and rolling resistance. The Goodyear and the Golf worked beautifully together in all conditions. If it just had a little bit more dry braking, it would have probably won the test. It's another no compromise product from Goodyear, something they're very strong at the moment. And finally, who'd have guessed it, the Michelin Cross Climate 2 is back at the top, winning the test overall. Once again, this tyre was best in dry braking, the best in the snow, had good levels of comfort, great aquaplaning and a very low rolling resistance. So is this the perfect all-season tyre? Well, no, once again, not quite. It was 6th in wet braking and 8th in wet handling, which is a common theme of the Cross Climate 2. Michelin, please give this tyre more wet performance in the next iteration, even if it comes at the expense of that snow performance, and the segment will once again have an unrivaled king. There's no denying the Michelin Cross Climate 2 is the best all-season tyre money can buy in the dry and snow, but I just think wet should be a little bit more important in that sort of performance diagram, the trade-offs. Anyway, these have been the results based on my own score weighting, but which tyre is best for you? As I've said, head over to the link in the description for the Tyre Reviews website so you can put your own score weighting in, and let me know in the comments what you decide and what's best for you. Also, while you're on the Tyre Reviews website, please leave a review of the tyres because it really helps me and the channel, and comment below, like it, subscribe, you know the drill. Any comments, questions, please ask below, and as always, safe motoring.